Good evening, my babies. Pull your chair in close and let Auntie May talk to you for a minute. Because this story didn't start in that restaurant and it didn't end at that locked door. It started years earlier with silence, with endurance, with smiling through pain and calling it strength. That night my knees were weak, my chest was heavy and my spirit was tired in ways no doctor's chart could measure. And when that waitress locked the door, it wasn't just to keep me safe. It was life saying, sit down now before you fall down. So listen close, because if you've ever ignored your body, ignored your intuition, or told yourself I'll be fine one more time, this one is for you. I learned that the body does not betray us, it informs us long before collapse ever arrives. It speaks in quiet sensations and gentle shifts that we learn to dismiss because we have been trained to value endurance over awareness and productivity over presence. That night my body had been talking to me all day in ways I chose not to hear. My hands trembled slightly when I reached for my purse, my vision blurred just enough to make the lights look softer than they were. My chest felt heavy, not like pain but like weight, like something pressing down, asking to be acknowledged. And still I told myself, you are fine, you have handled worse, you always do. That is how the whisper gets ignored, because it does not sound urgent enough to interrupt responsibility, and it does not feel dramatic enough to justify stopping and resting. And in that choice to ignore the whisper, we slowly teach our bodies that we will only listen when the message becomes unbearable. The whisper often comes as fatigue that does not match the work you have done, or sadness that shows up without a clear reason, or a sudden shortness of breath that passes quickly enough for you to dismiss it as anxiety or hunger or age, and we label it something small so we can keep moving, because stopping feels dangerous to people who learned early that rest could be taken away and safety was conditional. The body knows when the soul has been overdrawn, it knows when the load is too heavy and when the pace has become unsustainable, but instead of screaming right away, it tries to protect you by sending early signals, asking gently for attention, asking for a pause, asking for kindness. I think about how many times I ignored those signals before that evening, how many mornings I woke up already tired, how many meals I skipped because there was always something more important, how many moments of joy felt distant, like I was watching my own life from behind glass. Those were whispers too, but I translated them into weakness or lack of discipline or something I needed to push through. We often confuse numbness with strength, because numbness allows us to keep functioning without feeling the cost, but the cost does not disappear, it simply accumulates quietly until the body decides the whisper is no longer enough. When the body screams, it is not trying to punish you, it is trying to save you. The scream comes as dizziness that will not pass, or a heart that races without permission, or knees that suddenly cannot support the weight they have carried for years. The scream is urgent because the whisper was ignored, and that scream often arrives at the most inconvenient time, because collapse does not check your calendar, it does not wait for a safer moment or a more private space. It arrives when the system has reached its limit, and in that moment people often feel shame instead of relief, because we were taught that needing help is a failure rather than a biological truth. What I wish I had understood sooner is that listening to the whisper is an act of self-respect. It is a declaration that your well-being matters even when no one else is watching. It is choosing to believe your body, even when the symptoms are subtle and invisible to others. It is taking fatigue seriously before it becomes illness, and acknowledging emotional overload before it turns into physical breakdown. The whisper is an invitation to intervene early, to care gently, and to adjust your life before the damage deepens. So many of us live in a constant state of override. We override hunger, override exhaustion, override grief, override fear, override intuition. We tell ourselves later, 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 and the body keeps score. It remembers every time you said just one more thing, just one more task, just one more sacrifice, and eventually it asks for payment, not out of cruelty but out of necessity, because survival requires balance, and the body will always choose survival over your plans. Listening to the whisper means slowing down enough to notice patterns. It means asking yourself why you are tired even when you slept, why your chest feels tight when nothing is technically wrong, why joy feels muted, why your patience is thin, why your body feels older than your years. Those questions are not signs of weakness, they are signs of awareness, and awareness is the first step toward healing, because you cannot protect what you refuse to notice. When I think back to that night, I realize the moment did not begin with the locked door. It began hours earlier, when my body first tried to get my attention and I brushed it aside because I was used to carrying discomfort like it was part of my identity. I had learned to function while depleted, to smile while strained, to show up even when my inner reserves were empty, and that skill was praised for so long that I mistook it for health. But resilience without rest is not strength, it is erosion, and erosion happens quietly, grain by grain, until something gives. If you are listening to this and you recognize yourself in these words, I want you to understand that the whisper is still a gift. It means you have time to choose differently, time to slow the pace, time to ask for support, time to rest without apology, time to honor the signals before they turn into emergencies. You do not need to wait for collapse to justify care. You do not need a crisis to earn compassion. Your body is allowed to be believed at the whisper stage. The most radical thing you can do is pause when the world expects you to push through. It is radical to take a deep breath when urgency surrounds you. It is radical to sit down when everyone else keeps moving. It is radical to say I need a moment without explaining or apologizing, and it is radical to trust that listening to your body will not ruin your life but may in fact save it. I learned that night that strength is not the ability to ignore pain. Strength is the willingness to respond to it with wisdom. Strength is knowing when to rest before the fall, and humility is recognizing that your body is wiser than your schedule and kinder than your self-criticism. If you learn to listen when it whispers, you may never have to hear it scream, and that is a mercy worth choosing every single time. Survival mode is a place many of us learned to live in long before we understood we had a choice. It is a posture of the soul that stays alert, guarded, and braced even when there is no immediate danger, because danger once lived there and taught us to stay ready. Survival mode is waking up already tired but telling yourself you will rest later. Survival mode is eating when you remember, sleeping when you crash, and smiling because people expect it. Survival mode is doing what needs to be done without asking how it is costing you, because you learned early that asking questions did not change outcomes and complaining did not bring relief, so you adapted, and adaptation kept you alive, but it also quietly stole your softness. In survival mode, your nervous system never fully stands down. It stays on watch, scanning for problems, anticipating needs, preparing for disappointment, and holding everything together with willpower alone. You may look functional to the outside world, even successful, even dependable, but inside you are clenched like a fist. You move through your days checking boxes, completing tasks, and solving problems, yet rarely feeling present or peaceful. Joy becomes muted, laughter feels brief, and rest never quite restores you because your body does not believe it is safe enough to let go. I lived like that for years without realizing it, because survival mode does not announce itself. It disguises itself as responsibility, as ambition, as strength, as maturity. People praise you for it. They call you reliable, resilient, and selfless, and each compliment reinforces the habit of ignoring your own limits. You learn to push through discomfort because stopping feels risky and slowing down feels like falling behind. Survival mode convinces you that rest is something you earn after everything else is handled and everything else is never finished. What survival mode takes from you first is awareness. You stop checking in with your body and start commanding it. Instead, you tell it to keep going, to hold on, to wait until later, and later becomes a moving target. You stop noticing hunger until it turns into weakness. Stop noticing sadness until it turns into numbness. Stop noticing stress until it turns into pain. Survival mode is efficient, but it is expensive, and the bill always comes due. In survival mode, you become very good at functioning while disconnected. You show up for others while abandoning yourself. You solve crises while creating none of your own, because there is no space for your needs in a life built around endurance. You may even feel uncomfortable when things are calm, because calm feels unfamiliar and unfamiliar feels unsafe. So you stay busy, you stay needed, you stay alert, because stillness would require you to feel what you have been postponing. That night in the restaurant, I realized how deeply survival mode had shaped me, because even as my body was failing, my first instinct was not concern, it was control. I wanted to leave, to manage the situation privately, to not inconvenience anyone, to not draw attention. Survival mode teaches you to handle things alone, even when alone is the most dangerous place to be. It teaches you to minimize your pain so others can stay comfortable, and to keep moving so no one has to stop for you. Survival mode also distorts your sense of worth. You begin to measure your value by what you can produce, what you can endure, and how much you can carry without complaint. Rest starts to feel undeserved, and asking for help feels like an admission of failure. You forget that your worth was never tied to your output, and your humanity was never meant to be proven through exhaustion. The hardest part about survival mode is that it often begins as a necessity. Maybe you grew up in chaos or scarcity. Maybe you had to mature early or care for others before you were cared for. Maybe you learned that showing weakness invited harm, so you armored up, and that armor protected you once, but armor is heavy, and wearing it long after the battle ends slowly drains the life out of you. Survival mode is supposed to be temporary, but when it becomes a lifestyle, it starts to erode your health, your joy, and your sense of self. Living in survival mode means your body never gets the signal that it is safe, and a body that does not feel safe cannot heal, it cannot rest deeply, it cannot regulate properly, and it cannot sustain the pace forever. Eventually it finds a way to force a stop, through illness, through panic, through collapse, because it is designed to keep you alive, not to keep you productive. I see now that I was not living, I was managing, I was enduring, I was getting through and calling it life. I postponed joy, postponed rest, postponed myself because there was always one more thing to handle, one more person to support, one more responsibility to carry. Survival mode tells you that if you stop, everything will fall apart, but the truth is that everything falls apart when you never stop. When the door locked that night, it interrupted my survival pattern. It removed my ability to push through and forced me to sit with what was happening in my body and spirit. It was uncomfortable and humbling and necessary, because survival mode does not end gently. It ends when you decide to choose yourself, or when your body decides for you. To step out of survival mode, you must first recognize it without judgment. You must understand that it once served you and thank it for keeping you alive, and then gently tell it that you are safe enough now to choose a different way. You begin by listening to your body instead of overriding it, by resting before you are exhausted, by eating before you are depleted, by speaking before resentment builds, and by asking for help before you collapse. Leaving survival mode does not happen all at once. It happens in small choices repeated daily. It happens when you take a break without earning it, when you say no without explaining, when you sit down even though there is more to do, and when you allow yourself to feel without rushing to fix or suppress those feelings. It feels unfamiliar at first and even frightening, because peace can feel like vulnerability to someone who has been braced for years. But slowly your body learns that it does not have to stay on guard all the time. Your breath deepens, your sleep improves, your mind quiets, and your joy begins to return in moments that feel simple and profound. At the same time, you realize that living is not the same as surviving, and that you were never meant to spend your entire life just getting through. Survival mode kept you alive, but it is not where you were meant to stay. You deserve a life that includes rest, presence, and softness. You deserve to feel your own heartbeat without fear, and to sit in stillness without guilt. You deserve to live, not just endure, and choosing to step out of survival mode is not selfish. It is the bravest, most honest thing you can do for yourself and for everyone who loves you. Help sometimes arrives in forms that do not look like rescue, and it often comes from people who have no history with us, no obligation to us, and no script for how to respond, yet they see what those closest to us may have missed, or what we ourselves refuse to admit. Help from strangers can feel unsettling because it bypasses the narratives we have built about independence and self-reliance, and it challenges the belief that we must be strong enough to handle everything on our own. I remember how unfamiliar it felt to be truly seen by someone who knew nothing about my past, yet recognized my present distress without hesitation. There is a quiet honesty in the way strangers help, because they are not invested in who you think you are supposed to be. They respond only to what is happening in front of them. They do not carry expectations about your strength or your role or your history. They see a human being in need, and they act without overthinking. The moment that Waitress did not ask me to justify my weakness, she did not ask for a backstory, she did not measure whether my pain was deserving. She trusted her instincts, and she trusted what her eyes told her, and that kind of clarity is rare. For many of us, accepting help from strangers feels harder than accepting it from loved ones, because it strips away the illusion of control. With people who know us, we can negotiate, we can downplay, we can promise to be fine later, but with strangers there is no shared history to hide behind, no expectations to manage, no roles to perform. Their help is immediate and direct, and that can feel exposing because it forces us to confront our vulnerability without the comfort of familiarity. I realized in that moment how deeply I had been conditioned to believe that needing help was a personal failure, and that asking for it was a burden placed on others. That belief did not come from nowhere. It was learned through years of being praised for handling things alone and being rewarded for not needing anything from anyone. Help from strangers disrupts that conditioning, because it arrives without judgment and without negotiation, and it asks only one thing in return: that you receive it. There is also something sacred about help that comes from unexpected places, because it reminds us that we are part of a larger human fabric, one that does not require intimacy to offer care. We often underestimate the capacity of people around us to respond with compassion, because we are so focused on protecting ourselves from disappointment that we forget kindness exists beyond our inner circles. The truth is that sometimes strangers show up precisely because they have no reason not to. Accepting help from strangers requires humility, because it means admitting that you cannot do everything alone and that your strength has limits. Humility is not weakness, it is clarity. It is the understanding that being human means being interdependent, and that no one is meant to navigate life entirely on their own. When you allow a stranger to help you, you are acknowledging that you are not above needing care, and that acknowledgement can be both frightening and freeing. I think about how many times I have declined help because it did not come from the right person or in the right way or at the right time. I wanted help that fit neatly into my narrative, help that did not challenge my self-image or disrupt my plans, but real help rarely arrives on our terms. It arrives when we need it, not when we are ready for it, and it often comes in forms that require us to let go of pride and control. Strangers have a unique ability to interrupt patterns because they are not part of them. They can see clearly what insiders may normalize. They can recognize distress where others see routine. They can respond with urgency where others assume resilience, and that clarity can be life-saving when you are too close to your own struggle to see it objectively. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to validate what you have been minimizing. There is also a lesson in how quickly strangers can act when they trust their instincts. That waitress did not second-guess herself. She did not wait for confirmation. She did not ask permission to care. She moved because she sensed something was wrong, and she chose action over hesitation. We often talk ourselves out of helping others because we fear being wrong or intrusive, but her response showed me that caring does not require certainty, it requires courage. Receiving help from strangers can also restore faith in humanity at moments when we feel most isolated. Vulnerability has a way of convincing us that we are alone in our struggles, that no one would understand or care, but when someone unexpected steps in, it reminds us that compassion exists beyond our immediate circles, and that kindness does not always require deep connection. Sometimes it simply requires attention. I learned that allowing myself to be helped by someone I did not know was an act of trust. Trust in her judgment, trust in my own need, and trust in the idea that I was worthy of care even without a relationship to justify it. That kind of trust is difficult for people who have learned to rely only on themselves, but it is also necessary for healing, because isolation masquerading as independence can be just as harmful as dependence without boundaries. There is a quiet relief that comes with surrendering to help, because it allows you to rest from being the one who always manages, who always anticipates, who always holds everything together. When someone else steps in, even briefly, it gives your nervous system permission to stand down, and that pause can be the difference between collapse and recovery. Sometimes the most healing thing is not the help itself, but the realization that you do not have to do everything alone. I think about how many opportunities for connection we miss because we are unwilling to accept help from outside our familiar circles. How many moments of shared humanity pass us by because we are too guarded to receive them. Accepting help from strangers does not diminish your independence, it expands your understanding of community. It reminds you that support can come from many directions, and that you are allowed to receive it wherever it appears. There is also something transformative about being helped by someone who expects nothing in return. Their kindness is not transactional, it is not tied to future favors or obligations, it exists purely in the moment, and that purity can be deeply healing, especially for those who have learned that support always comes with strings attached. Experiencing unconditional assistance, even briefly, can begin to rewire beliefs about worth and deservingness. In that locked room, I was forced to confront the reality that my life had become too narrow, defined by what I could handle alone and what I could manage without assistance. The help I received from a stranger expanded that definition and reminded me that strength includes knowing when to accept support, and wisdom includes recognizing it regardless of its source. Strangers often become mirrors reflecting truths we are not ready to see in ourselves. They notice our shaking hands, our shallow breaths, our distant eyes. Because they are not invested in our performance, they respond to reality, not presentation, and that honesty can be uncomfortable, but it is also invaluable because it cuts through denial and brings us face to face with our needs. Allowing help from strangers is a practice in vulnerability, and vulnerability is not about exposing everything. It is about being honest in the moment about what you need. It is about saying yes when support is offered, and trusting that doing so does not make you weak or incapable, it makes you human. I carry that lesson with me now, and I try to remember that help is not something to be earned or controlled. It is something to be received with gratitude and grace, whether it comes from a lifelong friend or a passing stranger. Each act of kindness is a reminder that we are not alone, and that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never expected to meet. I spent a long time believing that if I did not name my pain, it would somehow lose its power over me, that if I kept it small, kept it quiet, kept it tucked away behind a smile and a steady voice, it would eventually disappear. But pain does not work like that. Pain grows in the dark, it feeds on dismissal, and it multiplies in silence, and the more you minimize it, the more it spreads into places you did not expect, until one day it is no longer something you can tuck away. It is something that stands in front of you, demanding to be acknowledged. Minimizing pain often starts as a survival skill. You learn early that expressing discomfort brings inconvenience to others or invites judgment or changes how people see you, so you tell yourself it is not that bad. You tell yourself others have it worse. You tell yourself you should be grateful, and those thoughts may sound reasonable, even mature, but what they really do is teach you to doubt your own experience. You learn to gaslight yourself before anyone else has the chance, and over time you forget how to tell the truth about what hurts. I used to call my exhaustion tiredness, my sadness stress, my anxiety nerves, my loneliness independence, and my physical pain something I would deal with later. Later became a habit, a way of postponing myself until I was more deserving of care, until things calmed down, until I finished everything for everyone else. But later is a dangerous word because it gives pain permission to settle in and make itself at home. When you minimize pain, you start measuring it against imaginary standards. You ask yourself, is it bad enough? Is it visible enough? Is it dramatic enough to justify attention? And if it does not meet those standards, you silence it. But pain does not require permission to exist. It does not need to be the worst pain in the room to be real. It does not need witnesses to be valid, and it does not need to compete with anyone else's suffering to deserve care. I learned that unspoken pain does not stay emotional. It eventually becomes physical because the body carries what the mouth refuses to say. It shows up in tight shoulders, clenched jaws, shallow breathing, headaches, stomach issues, fatigue, and a heaviness you cannot explain. And when doctors cannot find a clear cause, we call it stress, as if stress is not a serious condition, as if stress does not quietly break people down every day. There is a particular kind of harm that comes from minimizing pain when you are someone others rely on, because you become skilled at performing wellness while falling apart privately. You show up, you deliver, you smile, you reassure, and inside you are fraying at the edges. This performance may earn praise, but it also deepens the divide between how you appear and how you feel, and living in that split is exhausting because it requires constant self-monitoring, constant suppression, constant pretending. I remember how hard it was to say something is wrong because those words felt heavy, like an admission that I was failing at something I thought I was supposed to handle easily. I worried about being seen as dramatic or needy or weak, and those fears kept me quiet long after my body had begun to protest, and by the time I finally admitted the truth, I had already paid a price for the delay. Naming pain does not make it bigger, it makes it clearer, and clarity is what allows healing to begin. When you say this hurts, you stop fighting reality and start working with it. You give yourself access to options, to support, to rest, to treatment, to understanding, and to compassion. And compassion is a powerful medicine that cannot reach you if you keep insisting you are fine. There is also a grief that comes with acknowledging pain because it forces you to face what you have endured and what you have lost. Pretending everything is okay allows you to bypass that grief, but bypassing grief does not eliminate it, it just stores it in the body waiting for release, and when it finally surfaces it can feel overwhelming because it has been accumulating for years. I had to learn that being honest about pain does not make me ungrateful, it makes me authentic. It does not erase the good in my life, it simply acknowledges the parts that need attention. Joy and suffering can coexist, gratitude and honesty are not opposites, and you do not dishonor your blessings by admitting your burdens. Minimizing pain also teaches others how to treat you. When you say it is nothing, people believe you. When you say you are fine, they take you at your word and they move on, and over time your silence becomes the expectation, and breaking that silence later can feel disruptive or uncomfortable, but that discomfort is a sign that the truth is finally entering the room. There is courage in saying I am not okay even when you cannot explain exactly why. There is courage in admitting you need help before you reach a breaking point, and there is courage in allowing yourself to be seen without the armor of strength, because vulnerability is not the absence of strength, it is the willingness to stop pretending. I learned that healing does not begin with answers, it begins with honesty, and honesty begins the moment you stop minimizing what you feel and start treating it as information rather than inconvenience. Your pain is telling you something about your limits, your needs, your boundaries, and your humanity. Ignoring that message does not make you stronger, it makes you disconnected from yourself. The body keeps a record of every time you swallowed your words and dismissed your feelings, and it will eventually ask you to reconcile that account, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, but always with the same message: pay attention, you cannot outrun what lives inside you. When I finally allowed myself to say something is wrong without immediately rushing to fix it, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear because I did not know what would come next, and relief because I was no longer carrying the lie that everything was fine. That honesty created space to rest, space to breathe, space to receive care, and space to begin healing. You do not need permission to take your pain seriously. You do not need a diagnosis to justify rest. You do not need validation from others to honor what your body and spirit are telling you. Your experience is enough, your feelings are enough, and your need for care is reason enough. If you are listening to this and you have been minimizing your pain, I want you to know that you are allowed to stop. You are allowed to say this hurts. You are allowed to ask for support, and you are allowed to prioritize your healing without waiting for a crisis. You do not have to earn rest by breaking down. You can choose it now. Naming pain is not a declaration of defeat. It is a commitment to yourself. It is saying, I matter enough to listen, I matter enough to respond, and I matter enough to heal. And when you make that choice, you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were lost to endurance and silence, and in that reclamation there is strength, dignity, and the possibility of wholeness again. Slowing down felt like failure to me because I was raised to believe that momentum was proof of worth and that stopping meant falling behind. I learned early that being needed made me valuable and being busy made me invisible to criticism, so I kept moving even when my body begged for stillness, even when my spirit felt thin and frayed. Slowing down threatened the identity I had built as the one who could handle it, the one who kept things going, the one who did not need much from anyone else. When you are praised for endurance, you start to fear rest, because rest removes the evidence of your usefulness. If you are not doing, then who are you? If you are not producing, then what do you offer? These questions haunted me whenever I tried to pause, so I filled my days with motion and my nights with worry, because staying busy was easier than sitting with the quiet truth that I was exhausted and unsure and afraid of being seen without my strength. Slowing down also felt like letting people down, because so much of my self-worth was tied to meeting expectations I often placed on myself without anyone asking. I believed that if I rested, things would fall apart, that people would struggle, that opportunities would pass, that I would lose my place in the rhythm of life. Survival mode had taught me that there was no margin for pause, and that belief kept me running long after my body had reached its limits. What I did not understand then was that slowing down is not the same as giving up. It is not surrendering ambition or abandoning responsibility. It is recalibrating. It is choosing sustainability over burnout and presence over performance. But when you have spent years equating motion with safety, stillness can feel dangerous because it exposes what movement has been hiding. I remember how uncomfortable it felt the first time I truly stopped, not just physically but mentally. The silence was loud, my thoughts raced, my guilt surfaced, and my instinct was to get up and do something, anything to justify my existence. That discomfort was not a sign that rest was wrong, it was a sign that I had been neglecting myself for a long time. Slowing down felt foreign because I had lived so long without it. There is a particular fear that comes with slowing down for people who have been strong for others. The fear that if you stop, no one will catch you. The fear that your needs will be inconvenient. The fear that you will be judged for needing what you so freely give. Slowing down requires trust. Trust that the world will not collapse. Trust that you are allowed to take up space without performing. Trust that your worth is not erased when you are still. Slowing down also forces you to feel, and feeling can be overwhelming when emotions have been postponed for years. Grief, anger, sadness, and fatigue all surface at once, demanding attention, and that flood can feel like failure because it disrupts the image of composure you have worked so hard to maintain. But emotions do not disappear when ignored, they wait, and slowing down simply opens the door for them to be processed rather than stored. I learned that my resistance to slowing down was not about laziness or discipline, it was about fear of being seen. Without armor, fear of confronting my own limits, fear of discovering that I had built a life that required me to run at an unsustainable pace. Acknowledging that reality felt like admitting I had made mistakes, and I was not ready to face that truth. But the truth is that slowing down does not mean you have failed. It means you are listening. It means you are choosing longevity over urgency and health over applause. It means you are recognizing that a life lived at full speed without rest eventually costs more than it gives, and that cost is often paid with your health, your joy, and your sense of self. I began to understand that slowing down is an act of courage because it goes against a culture that glorifies hustle and sacrifice. It requires you to redefine success not as how much you can endure but as how well you can care for yourself and others. It requires you to disappoint expectations that were never fair to begin with, and to prioritize your well-being even when it feels uncomfortable. Slowing down also reveals what truly matters. When the noise fades, you begin to notice what brings you peace and what drains you. You see which commitments align with your values and which ones exist only out of obligation. You recognize relationships that nourish you and those that rely solely on your availability. This clarity can be unsettling because it may require change, and change is rarely easy. I had to grieve the version of myself who believed she had to earn rest through exhaustion and who thought slowing down meant falling behind. I had to forgive myself for not knowing better and for pushing my body beyond its limits in the name of responsibility. That forgiveness was part of the slowing down process because healing requires compassion, not just rest. As I allowed myself to slow down, I noticed small shifts. My breath deepened, my sleep improved, and my thoughts became less frantic. Moments of joy returned quietly, like they had been waiting for permission, and I realized that slowing down had not taken anything away from me. It had given me back parts of myself I thought were lost. Slowing down does not mean stopping forever. It means pausing long enough to listen to your body and your spirit. It means adjusting your pace to something you can sustain and giving yourself grace when you need to rest. It means understanding that productivity is not the measure of your worth and that your value does not disappear when you sit still. I learned that slowing down is not failure, it is wisdom. It is recognizing that you are human, not a machine, and that your needs matter. It is choosing to live in a way that honors your limits rather than constantly pushing against them, and in that choice there is freedom. Freedom from the relentless pressure to prove yourself, and freedom to live a life that includes rest, presence, and care. If you are afraid to slow down because you think it means you are failing, I want you to know that slowing down may be the most successful thing you ever do, because it allows you to continue living with intention and health rather than burning out in silence. You do not lose your strength when you rest, you restore it, and restoration is not weakness, it is preparation for a life that is fuller, gentler, and more sustainable. Slowing down taught me that I am allowed to exist without producing, that I am allowed to rest without explanation, and that I am allowed to choose myself without guilt. Those lessons did not come easily, but they came honestly, and they changed the way I move through the world. Now I move with intention, I listen more closely, and I rest without apology, because I understand now that slowing down was never failure, it was survival done with wisdom and self-respect. Sometimes life does not whisper, and sometimes it does not wait for permission. Sometimes it reaches out and locks the door because you have proven you will keep running back into what harms you. I used to think interruptions were punishments. I believed delays were failures and obstacles were proof that I was doing something wrong. But that night I learned that some interruptions are mercy wearing a rough disguise. That locked door was not there to trap me. It was there to protect me from myself. I had become skilled at escaping moments that asked me to feel. Whenever my body signaled distress, my instinct was to leave. Leave the conversation. Leave the room. Leave the feeling. Leave the truth. I told myself I was managing things gracefully when in reality I was avoiding them efficiently. That door refused to let me retreat into denial. It forced me to stay present with what was happening instead of outrunning it. There are times when we beg life for clarity and times when clarity arrives without asking us first. The locked door was clarity. It said stop now. It said you cannot keep going like this. It said your habit of returning to harm dressed up as normal must end here. I wanted to step back into motion. I wanted to apologize and minimize and promise I would be fine. But the door said no more. I had been running back into environments that drained me, back into expectations that crushed me, back into roles that required my silence. Each time I told myself it was temporary. Each time I convinced myself I could handle it. And each time I left a little more of myself behind. Life watched patiently until patience was no longer an option. Then it intervened. Sometimes mercy does not feel gentle. Sometimes it feels embarrassing or inconvenient or frightening. Sometimes mercy feels like being exposed in a moment you wanted to manage privately. I felt ashamed at first. Ashamed that I needed help. Ashamed that I could not just walk out and pull myself together. But shame was not the lesson. Safety was. Life locked the door because I had locked myself out of rest. I had locked myself out of honesty. I had locked myself out of listening to my own limits. That night the roles reversed. Life did for me what I refused to do for myself. It created a boundary I would not cross. It created a pause I would not choose. It created a moment of stillness I desperately needed. We often think freedom means being able to leave whenever we want. But sometimes freedom means being stopped before we destroy ourselves. I thought I wanted escape. What I needed was containment. I needed to be held in place long enough for my nervous system to calm. Long enough for my breath to return. Long enough for my mind to stop negotiating reality. There is a pattern many of us carry. When things get heavy we leave. When feelings rise we retreat. When consequences approach we distract ourselves. Life notices patterns, and when a pattern threatens your well-being, life finds a way to interrupt it. The interruption may look harsh, but it is rooted in care. I realized that if the door had been open, I would have walked right back into the same cycle. I would have smiled. I would have said I was fine. I would have driven home and collapsed later in silence. The locked door saved me from postponing myself again. It said, this moment matters. You matter. Right now. Sometimes we pray for protection from dangers we can see. But the most dangerous thing is often our own habit of endurance. Our willingness to tolerate what is hurting us. Our tendency to call it strength. Life locked the door to protect me from that habit. It protected me from my own conditioning. I learned that boundaries are not always something we set. Sometimes boundaries are set for us when we refuse to set them ourselves. That does not mean we are weak. It means we are human. It means we needed help learning where to stop. There was a strange peace that followed once I surrendered to the pause. Once I stopped fighting the interruption. Once I accepted that I was not meant to push through this moment. In that stillness I felt cared for. Not judged. Not punished. Cared for. Life will often repeat lessons until we listen. I had ignored smaller warnings. I had dismissed quieter signals. So the message arrived louder. Not to scare me but to reach me. Not to shame me but to save me. I think about how many times we run back into harm because it feels familiar. We mistake familiarity for safety. We return to what we know even when it costs us. Life sometimes blocks the path back to what is familiar so we can discover what is healthier. That locked door changed how I see interruptions now. I no longer rush to label them as setbacks. I ask what they might be protecting me from. I ask what pattern they are interrupting. I ask what I am being asked to face or feel or change. Sometimes the door closes because the next chapter cannot begin until the previous one stops repeating. Sometimes the door closes because you are not meant to carry what you are carrying any longer. Sometimes the door closes because survival is no longer enough and something deeper is required. Life locked the door, and in doing so it opened something else. It opened my awareness. It opened my willingness to receive care. It opened my understanding that I do not have to prove my worth by enduring harm. If you find yourself stopped right now, delayed, interrupted, unable to move forward the way you planned, consider the possibility that this pause is protective. Consider that life may be keeping you from returning to something that no longer serves you. Not every closed door is rejection. Some are rescue. Not every interruption is failure. Some are mercy. Not every stop is an ending. Some are the beginning of a safer way forward. That night taught me that when life locks the door, it is not always saying you cannot go on. Sometimes it is saying you cannot go back. And learning the difference can save your life. Before I sit down, I want to leave you with this, my babies. If you remember nothing else from this story, remember this. Life does not interrupt you to punish you. It interrupts you to protect you. That locked door was not the end of my strength. It was the beginning of my honesty. It was the moment I stopped proving and started listening. The moment I stopped running and allowed myself to be held. So if life has slowed you down lately, if a door has closed without your permission, if your body has asked you to stop in ways you could not ignore, do not call yourself weak. Do not call yourself broken. Call yourself loved enough to be stopped. Sit with yourself. Breathe. Listen. Choose yourself before the fall. And promise Auntie May one thing. The next time your spirit whispers, you will not wait for life to lock the door. You will sit down on your own. With dignity, with wisdom, with self-respect.